Hi everyone, my name is Roger Luckhurst and I'm in the Department of English here at Birkbeck, and I hold the august title of Professor of 19th Century Studies. And some of my specialisms are to do with the history of the supernatural and the Gothic. So I've written books on mummy curses and the zombie, and I've edited Bram Stoker's Dracula. Interested in the undead or those categories of the undead. So I guess it wasn't surprising that the people in the college asked me to do a little recording for Halloween. So I'm going to tell you not a ghost story, but a meta ghost story, which is my research at the moment is about a group of strange gentlemen in the late 19th century who started meeting in 1882, and they called themselves the Ghost Club. And the first rule of Ghost Club was never to talk about Ghost Club, obviously, but the second one was to be a group of people who were going to be sympathetic, like-minded, non-judgmental, and they had to commit to telling a true ghost story as they thought it to each other at least once a year. It was a very small club. It was full of people who were committed to esoteric studies, so interested in spiritualism, the conjuring up of the dead. They were interested in psychical research, which was a brand new sort of science in the late 19th century, full of very earnest people who were trying to find scientific proof for what they coined the word telepathy to describe, so this kind of communication between minds. They were very interested in esoteric and occult philosophies and religions, so theosophy was very big at this point as well. And they were also literary men who enjoyed a ghost story, and the late 19th century is a moment of an absolute high point, really, of the so-called club tale. That is, men, usually is men, gathering together, telling each other stories to freak each other out. So it's a very kind of self-conscious grouping as well. And the really extraordinary thing about this, they were proper Victorians in the sense that they kept a strict confidentiality, so you weren't allowed to discuss anything outside the halls of the Ghost Club. But they also were assiduous in keeping minutes. So there are thousands of pages of minutes that are kept now in the British Library. And I've been really excited to work with the Ghost Club, which is still going. In fact, I've just become a member. And they've allowed me to use those minutes and transcribe them, photograph them, work with them, really for the first time, because they've been kept under wraps ever since they were given to the British Library in 1936. So this is a group of men who fundamentally believe in the supernatural and are going to discuss this in closed doors, no one judging you. You're able to say whatever it is that you want to say. And it's a really interesting and strange, eccentric group. It was founded in 1882 by Alaric Watts, who was by day a tax inspector and by night an occultist, which is what most tax inspectors do, I think, at night. And he was very connected into spiritualist circles. His wife was a medium who could receive communications from the dead, and she was a very talented illustrator of spirit drawings as well, so she'd fall into a trance and do these extraordinary pictures and photographs. And he got together with the splendidly named Reverend William Stainton Moses, who was a Church of England priest, but who had a religious crisis and resigned his post. and then went through a whole series of spiritual crises. He was given a book by a friend, which was about spiritualism, and Stainton Moses developed very quickly his own ability in receiving communications, something that he himself found very bewildering, not least because in the end there were 49 different spirits talking to him and through him, which were transcribed in another set of minutes very, very precisely. And it became a whole kind of architecture of a philosophy of the afterlife. So this is someone who was respected simply because he found his own mediumship very bewildering and confusing, and he often argued with the spirits that were communicating through him over religious matters. So this was clearly a very kind of troubled figure. But these two together thought that they would develop this club just because spiritualism and psychical research was so controversial. There were so many people in Victorian public sphere who were mocking them, considering them absolute lunatics, or completely credulous fools. So they wanted a very private space in order to try and discuss this stuff. And they soon gathered together a group of people who, in a sense, are a wonderful, I'm finding, cross-section of the late Victorian gentleman clubland kind of world. So it's full of really interesting people. There's a guy called Charles Massey who was trained as a barrister but never really practiced law, preferring instead to hide away and consider metaphysical, mystical and spiritual matters, and was very widely respected in these kinds of groupings. A Christian mystic, someone very interested in the occult, a Mason, all of these sorts of things are kind of floating around, and he knew everyone. And then there's a whole batch of people that it's just been a great pleasure to try and track down, because they have such amazingly kind of eccentric set of interests. So one of the first members, for example, was a man called Arthur Lilly, who had been in the Indian Army. He'd served out in India with great distinction. He'd written a couple of novels. They're very bad. He'd written some poetry, slightly worse, but also someone who was very interested in Eastern philosophy and religion. So he'd got into all kinds of Eastern studies, Buddhism and theosophy as it was emerging from India, all of those sorts of interests. So he was very interested in that, and he published a book called Modern Mystics and Modern Magic, which was an investigation of these kinds of areas as well. But crucially, he was also a man who was of the gentleman's clubland world of that time around Pall Mall in London, and so wrote a crucial book on the rules of croquet, and actually arguably founded the first and most important competition for croquet in Scotland in the 1880s. So there's a kind of mix of interest there. Another early member was Colonel Drayson, who had, as his title suggests, been in the army, but he mainly lectured to people in the Woolwich Arsenal. So he was someone who was training them in mathematics and engineering and ordnance and all those sorts of things. Very distinguished career around the world. He was also an amateur astronomer. He was spectacularly wrong about most things in astronomy, but nevertheless, this was an era when the amateur astronomer was someone who was still able to contribute to the emerging professional discourse around those subjects. And he retired to Southsea and became quite interested in the occult and in spiritualism. And he was the man who persuaded his local GP, Arthur Conan Doyle, to come along to some seances and sort of investigate whether he thought that they were true or not. And so he is the man responsible for turning Arthur Conan Doyle into a spiritualist. He indeed became, Conan Doyle, the most famous spiritualist in the 20th century. So he was a really strong advocate who toured the world lecturing about these sorts of things. And Conan Doyle was a guest of the Ghost Club and did come along and talk to them about his experiences as well. He did fundamentally believe absolutely anything you told him, as you might know, famously confirmed the truth of the photograph of the Cottingley fairies. But nevertheless, this is the kind of club that he would join and tell ghost stories to. And there are other kind of famous people who kind of arrived and told their stories. They were colonial administrators, some of them very famous, like Sir Harry Johnston. But there were also Egyptologists like Wallace Budge, who looked after the British Museum collection of Egyptian mummies, and painters like William Blake Richmond and people like this who would also kind of come along and tell stories. So it's an amazing untapped resource. And just at the end, I think I'll kind of jump in and tell you one of these amazing stories. So around about 1896, a new member of the Ghost Club was elected by his fellow brother ghosts, as they called themselves, and he was a guy called Thomas Douglas Murray. And Thomas Douglas Murray kind of knew everyone in London. He was a very kind of famous socialite, and knew painters and artists and singers and novelists, and he was very into colonial projects, so knew lots of kind of famous colonialists. He was someone who was involved in the smuggling of the first breeding pair of Pekingese dogs out of China, very famously and controversially. Very, very extraordinary kind of range and mix of things he was interested in. But he was famous in London because he only had one arm. And he only had one arm because the story went, as a young man, he had gone to Egypt in the wake of that very fashionable move to take a journey down the Nile. In the course of that journey at Luxor, he bought illegally a mummy case, so just the kind of coffin lid, if you like, of the mummy. And the story went that the next day he went out quail hunting with a short gun and slipped and accidentally shot himself through the arm rather painfully. And being a stern Victorian gentleman, just went, oh, not again, and tied a tourniquet around his completely ruined arm and walked back to his hotel. But at this point, the story of the Thomas Douglas Murray cursed by a mummy tale begins to circulate around his friends, around London. It's told many times. It becomes even more famous when this mummy case moves into the British Museum. It became a gift in 1886. And Thomas Douglas Murray was someone who would take people to the British Museum and introduce them to his curse. Essentially, you can go and see this mummy case. It's item 22542, which is in the Egyptian rooms. It's there just amongst all the other Egyptian artifacts. But in the late Victorian period and in the run-up to Tutankhamun, this was one of the most famous objects in London that you would go and see and thrill yourself with the thought that merely to gaze on the eyes of the priestess of Amun-Ra, you would be cursed. And I was really amazed to discover in these minutes that Thomas Douglas Murray told this story to his fellow brother ghost. In fact, he told it several times in several different ways in these minutes. So for me, it was fantastic because you get to hear the actual voice, in a way, of the man at the centre of so many myths and so many stories about the unlucky mummy in the British Museum. So if you happen to be near Birkbeck College in Bloomsbury, we are very near the back entrance to the British Museum, which is where the Egyptian rooms are. So if you're feeling you need a little bit of a thrill around about Halloween, then just go and go and gaze on the eyes of the priestess of Amun-Ra and see if you survive, because so many people haven't. With that, I'm going to leave you. have a happy Halloween. Have a happy All Saints Day as well, All Souls Day rather, on November the 2nd, also the Mexican Day of the Dead. That day for the Ghost Club was the most important because that was the day that you remembered and paid homage to your beloved dead, and they were the nearest to you between these worlds of our world and the afterlife. They were close to us, hovering nearby. So with that, I will say goodbye and stay safe and enjoy Halloween.